the questions that you have. So whenever speakers are speaking, please keep taking your notes. Please keep penning down your questions because the biggest beneficiaries, I can see many students sitting on the other side. They are actually going to be the biggest beneficiaries of the inclusive growth. So your very pertinent particular question that you wanted to put forward for today's agenda can shape the discussion. So with this, let me now formally begin by inviting Dr. Abid Salari sir for his opening remarks. Sir.
Thank you, Sajid, honorable dignitaries on the panel, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Do we have anyone who can't follow Urdu in this hall? I just go through, so whether we can be bilingual or should I just follow this? Well, thank you very much. And today's discussion, it is a precursor, you could say a curtain raiser to our annual event, annual Sustainable Development Conference that would be held from 6th till 9th of December. Of course, some of the things that we'll be discussing in that conference directly relate to today's topic. So our the theme for our annual conference is sustainable development amid pandemics. So more precisely, beyond pandemics, leaving no one behind. So when we're talking about leaving no one behind, we directly talk about inclusive growth. Also we want to discuss the risks and challenges to inclusive growth and what are the way forwards. And that is why all the dignitaries who are present here, we want to get educated from them to contextualize the discussion for our annual conference in a better manner. I hope many of them, they will be part of our panels in the annual discussion. So audience sitting there, I would request you to keep following STPI's webpage to find out the detailed agenda of the conference. But coming back to today's discussion, risks and challenges, I think one of the key risks that I see to inclusive growth, not only in Pakistan, but also in the rest of the world, we only came to know about it yesterday, and that is Omicron, the new variant of concern of this COVID-19 virus that not only led to airspace closure and travel restrictions in many countries, but the immediate jerk was this fall in price of oil products up to $10 per barrel. Omicron, as we have seen so far, all the variants that come to this world, by a lag of around 1 to 2 months, they hit Pakistan as well. So far, we have braved the 4 variants of virus, and we have managed, I would say, quite successfully by the grace of although every life matters, and our heart goes for all those who lost their loved ones in this pandemic. But if you look at the collateral loss, collective loss due to COVID, Pakistan did comparatively well compared to other peer economies. But one of the risks that I see is this new variant, how the vaccines that we have would behave to new variant, and how it would affect our trading partners and the rest of the world. Second risk that I feel is still the energy prices, although, as I said that yesterday, the oil prices tumbled by $10 to $13. Brent, it went down to $70 per barrel. WTI, it was also hovering around that. So from 88 to $70 per barrel, while it is a good news for Pakistan that our oil import bill that would get reduced, but also one needs to see that how it would unfold in the days and weeks to come. So it still remain a risk. The challenges that I can think of, and I would be extremely keen to learn from our distinguished panels. The first challenge on my list is geopolitical challenges, especially what is happening in Afghanistan and how it is affecting or how it will affect Pakistan. So we know that when we talk of graduating from bottom, when we talk of our negotiations with IMF and IMF conditionalities, we are talking about our relationships with the West in general and with the USA in particular. So one needs to see that how Qatar in their plenary, how would they treat Pakistan. One would have to see that whether the types of waivers that we could get in the last IMF program, almost a dozen plus waivers that we got from IMF, and that was the only program that was completed successfully. Just for your record, rest of the other IMF programs, either those were concluded prematurely by Pakistan or those were terminated by IMF. So the last government's IMF program was the first successfully implemented program, and in that program, more than 13 waivers were obtained from IMF. Waiver means that if we are not able to fulfill a conditionality, we get a waiver for that. This time, due to our relations with the West, I don't see a possibility of getting waiver, and that would actually complicate the situation in Pakistan when we talk of different decision making, at least at macroeconomic level. And then, of course, this whole politicization of economy in Pakistan. And I'm referring to those loss-making public sector enterprises. So I know Tola Sahab also sits on a board of privatization. So privatization in Pakistan, it always got hit by this political wicket. So if you start tracing from Shaukat Aziz's era, so every time the opposition of the day, including current government, they actually opposed this privatization. And now, of course, PTI is also getting paid in the same flavor. Its opposition is not allowing it to privatize. And this is affecting basically the other matters. So if I look at the black holes in the economy under which we have to discuss this inclusion, one is, of course, this energy circular debt. That is almost twice the annual defense budget of Pakistan, 2.6 trillion rupees till today. And the state, loss-making state-owned enterprises, again another around 2 trillion rupees cumulative loss till today, 1.5 times our annual defense budget. So if we make a comparison of where the money is going, and of course money is going towards our debt payment, which accrue due to these two ineffective and inefficient spendings that are mandatory for us to do. So with this, of course, way forward, one of the way forward that I can think of, I don't see inflation going down in next 6 months. One has to see that how oil prices, those would unfold, but even then the ripple effect of global inflation that would keep us hunting at least for next 6 to 7 months. Now, in that period, what government can successfully do perhaps is to improve the purchasing power of people of Pakistan, create new jobs, strengthen the existing social safety nets. And I know Dr. Alia, she has done brilliant work on this poverty alleviation board, on which she was a member, and she was recommending how to strengthen social safety net. Targeted subsidies is another way forward, so on which IMF would have no objection. IMF have certainly objection on across the board subsidies, but if we can shift towards targeted subsidies, especially use of data that SAS program has collected, the computerized data triangulation with FPR and with NADA and other sources of data repositories, and filtering the people to whom the subsidies should be provided in a dignified manner. I think that's where the way forward is. And finally, this COVID, it has taught us one thing, and that is we can't ignore our social development sectors. If COVID was a black swan that hit us while we weren't prepared, there is ignoring social sector development, ignoring climate change. That is a gray rhino that is coming towards us, and that would hit us badly if we don't keep our house in order. And how to keep our house in order? Let's listen to the distinguished panel here. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us on this second event.
Thank you, Dr. Suleri, for bringing a discussion on some new challenges that are arising from COVID-19 and geopolitical situation to the economy of Pakistan that have a very deep-rooted impact on the inclusiveness of growth in itself. Thank you so much. Now let me invite for the keynote to Shahid Hafiz Kardar Sahab. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me first start by acknowledging the fact that my friends Zuleri and Makar have bestowed upon this honor of being the keynote speaker at this symposium. I looked at the title of what I had to say, and I started wondering. I mean, I still remember my early childhood, which is, of course, prehistoric times. We were still discussing this. Okay. My fear is in about 10 to 15 years, I may not be around, some will still be discussing the same issues, the same challenges, and of course, the way forward may have changed largely because the world would have moved on. Two things I will not do today. One, I'm not going to talk about the risk, two of the risks, which to me, I mean, we have to learn to live with pandemics. You know, COVID is not something which is going to go away. Flu BI, a lot of people lost their lives eventually. We found medication to take care of it. So we'll have to learn to live with it. So that's the whole world will have to learn to live with. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time discussing that aspect. The second risk is the Afghanistan factor, which, of course, in the short and medium term could be a big problem. But that's not an area of my good knowledge that I can speak at length on. The third area, which is more important, is I'm not going to discuss numbers. Numbers, and I agree with my friend Dr. Mismanagement, actually misses the real points. The real issues get missed, they get lost looking at numbers. And I know my friend Shabad Rana sitting here gets excited when he starts looking at a fiscal deficit number. And to me, for that example, taking that as an example, I find that a meaningless number. I mean, it's a cash-based system. Someone like Ishfaq can understand, and so can Javed. What is the point in discussing a cash-based number when most of the items are off the balance sheet? The liabilities aren't there. Look at the circular debt number, which isn't there, which will eventually get reflected a few years down the road. The losses of the state-owned enterprise is guaranteed by the government of Pakistan will eventually have to be picked up by you and me some year later. So looking at 1 year's fiscal number is not going to tell us anything. And I can go on, but I won't. Okay. So let me start off with what I regard as the key issues. So some of the risks that I want to talk about are actually built into the challenges of what I see as the ongoing and recurring weaknesses in the system. The first and foremost, Pakistan today is a very difficult and complex country to govern. It would be challenging for the most capable leadership anywhere in the world. And your guesses are better than mine as if we had the quality of the leadership which can address the kind of challenges that we face. And this is the result of what I would call the nature of the governing class, the internal failure of governance, both economic and political, the high rate of population growth, our inability essentially to absorb it, and more importantly, this is the more important part, we have a youth which is getting alienated for two reasons. One, the sense of entitlement that somehow they seem to have. B, and more importantly, is their exposure to the rest of the world through the internet, through cable television, and so their expectations are of such magnitude that managing those expectations will be a huge challenge for any government in the future. The third area, the demands and stresses and imperatives of the security state, I think I've said enough, which should be fairly straightforward to understand. Built into that, somehow our worldview is very different from ours. You know, we have a victim syndrome, and we have an exaggerated view of our importance. Somehow we are the center of the universe. So we live in this grand illusion that we are somehow, you know, such a nation that everyone should be looking at us. The fourth area, which is important, is how the structure, I'll come to the structure of the economy in a moment, the mistrust between Islamabad and the provinces. And there are widening regional disparities when it comes to the levels of growth, quality of the physical and social and economic infrastructure. Don't take it lightly, because this is now becoming a very serious issue going forward. And for me, the space for talks which are narrowing, and this is really going to affect social cohesion, which is critical for the kind of inclusive growth that we're all looking at for. We now have a more fractured society. Social divisions have actually deepened. And the reason I'm emphasizing that, and there are two factors which I think we need to understand. What has happened is that the structure of the economy over the last 20 odd years has actually changed. The growth sectors are now the financial sector, the IT sector, the telecommunication sector, the automobile sector, and the oil and gas sector. Why do you think that is important? The reason it is important is these are both capital intensive and skill intensive. And for the vast majority of the population, we have not provided decent quality basic education and skills, cannot participate meaningfully in this growth process. And this means that the polarization is deepening as we go forward, and it's widening both horizontally and vertically. The divisions are becoming deeper. And the reason I emphasize is that there are two startling indicators that have come forward. One that we were aware of in the sense of that you have graduates not having the knowledge and the skills to be employed by the market. And excellent work done by Dr. Nayab and Dr. Nadeem at PIDE, based on the recent labor force surveys. Two startling indicators. One, 31% now of the graduates are unemployed. And the second fascinating statistic for me is that those in the age group 15 to 29 years, 34% of them are no longer in the workforce. They have actually dropped out of the workforce. They're neither in universities or schools. They have actually dropped out of the workforce. So they're not being captured in the unemployment numbers. They've actually dropped out of the workforce, the labor force. And I think that to me is very important. Even if you look at what is happening to the industrial structure as a whole, because we rely on imported equipment and technology, most of that is technology which is not labor absorptive. So in a sense, even the formal sector cannot provide the kind of jobs that we think it could provide in the past. And the result of all that, as we know by now, is that we have a fairly unfair and unjust socio-economic system in which a lot of those have been left to fend for themselves, and hence this worry about the lack of inclusiveness of our growth process. What are the weaknesses which have been unattended for a long period? The poor governance has been reflected in the report, about 4 or 5 of them very quickly. Economic management, or by French, I would say mismanagement, has been the same for the last 40 years. So we result in near crisis situation every few years, and we end up knocking at the doors of the IMF that friend was reminding us. No serious effort to reform. We have continued to look at the international community to pay our bills. We've been helped by certain moments in our history, photo-issues events like the Cold War, the Afghan War, 9/11, the war against terror, and somehow we were quite happy. The elite, whatever the word elite means, quite happy having a whale of a time as long as they were prospering. They could care less what was happening to the rest of the country. So we somehow seem to think that we have a license to mismanage our affairs, that someone else should come and bail us out. The cost of it all has been well known. The slowing down of economic growth, we now become very difficult to actually go beyond 4% annual growth. And there is increasing vulnerability of the economy, and currency crisis become very common. So far, 2 things are very interesting. There has been no full-blown crisis yet, and there has been no sovereign default so far. So in a sense, but the cost is fairly obvious. We have learned to live, and I find it fascinating, referring to Robert Larry, Nelson, sitting here. I find it fascinating that we now we hear words like overeating of the economy when the economy is growing at barely 4.5%. So you start wondering there is something seriously wrong with the structure of the economy, that it overheats when we reach even 4.5%. Let me move on very quickly to some of the continuing weaknesses. I'm not going to talk about low tax GDP ratios. I leave that to Shastora, Shasmed. So I'm not going to talk about it. For me, the bigger problem is on the expenditure side of the fiscal equation. I'm very clear. We're wasting our time talking about tax revenues which should be collected and actually spent on this structure. Sorry, no deal. The priorities are misplaced. We have a large workforce in the public sector, which is absorbing large chunks of these revenues, but this workforce is of limited capability. We know that by now. A classic example is the size of the federal and provincial governments even after the 18th Amendment. Just looking at the federal government. After the 18th Amendment, we still have 40 divisions, 400 attached departments, 650,000 employees, autonomous organizations with 520,000 employees. And the rationalization that is required is resisted, both by bureaucrats and by the politicians. Bureaucrats, for the simple reason, was soch rahe yaar main joint secretary retire ho gayi. MNA keh rahe yaar, iska matlab main minister nahi banunga. So this, the political economy is resisting even that basic change. The losses of state-owned enterprises, Absalari has already talked about, which are now beyond 2.3 trillion. The huge footprint of the state, which is distorting markets, a favorite topic of Javed Hassan, I'm told, and which is raising the cost of doing business, essentially because of excessive regulation, obsolete, outdated, flawed regulations, there is very little clarity on why a particular activity needs to be regulated to begin with. The बाकी वैसे ना कि excessive है या नहीं है. I keep asking, and I still remember in my prehistoric times when I was the finance minister in the Punjab, I only had one request with my colleagues. And of course, it fell in their ears, needless to say. I said, yeah, let's do one thing. Let's decide today that all regulatory laws will stand rescinded today. And we asked the so-called administrative department to come and present before us the need to retain it. Let's not start with individual laws and clauses and sections. That is the only way forward. And I can go give several examples of why that is needed. And I will go into them. Non-transparent, discretion-laden regulatory frameworks used, we all know, for patronage purposes and other reasons we all know of how to do well for ourselves. Finally, on this topic is the domestic market, in my opinion, that has influenced the pattern and the level of economic growth. We have protected low-value producing industrial sector. We have protected them. And what has happened? You protect a particular sector, and in the process, all the allied industries, all allied sectors also get protected. And then in the process, all grow, all markets are growing simultaneously with different levels of inefficiencies. And then becomes politically almost impossible to address them because of the resistance that you see, forcing them to become competitive to external competitive forces. And it becomes even more difficult when the growth rate is low, the fair, political fair, unemployment, they become much more entrenched over a period of time. And then these legacy issues continue, and they've been continuing for more than 30 years. I've already discussed this, so I won't. So what is the way forward? I think I don't have to remind ourselves, and Abid has already mentioned it, that we need to recognize that we have to, frankly, put our own house in order. Outsiders, like the IMF, are under no obligation to sort out the mess that we've created ourselves. The role of the state has to change. It has to become, the more important part is the software part, to create opportunities, stimulate investment and productivity, and the focus has to be on laws, regulations, policy measures which support this in the software side of things, which is the software side of things, the laws, the instruments, and the processes. Of course, we need to revisit our defense framework and strategy from my area of expertise, but I think part of the adjustment will also have to be on the size of the conventional forces because of the drain on resources of that. So it has to be a sacrifice both at the civilian level as well as the defense. Many of these agencies and autonomous organizations, frankly, have to be bumped up. Very few probably could be candidates for privatization. The purposes for which they were created and for the uses they were created, frankly, have become redundant. Now come the more controversial parts. Retire those who've completed 25 years of service. Of course, you protect the pension entitlement. It's politically difficult. Please ask them to stay at home, save on rentals, cars, utilities. Continue to pay them, protect them. Surrender all vacant sanction positions and also make sure, put them in a surplus pool if you like, but just make sure all those posts get surrendered. We need to shift to the contributory pension scheme. Pension scheme of the federal government this year, if memory serves me right, is 480 billion. If you look at the pension liability, we keep referring to the fiscal deficit, the pension liability is now 9 trillion of both the provincial and the federal governments. That's the liability, 9 trillion liability. Of course, we'll only pay when they leave. But the reality is, there is an elephant in the room, in the shape of 9 trillion. So we need to move towards a contributory pension scheme, of course, protecting pension entitlements today. Salary revisions and monetization of perks will enable this shift. And of course, the financing is going to come from the release of private commercial land, the favorite of Dr. Nadimullah, release of private commercial land, which is being used currently for their housing. Knowing that someone would ask me the questions, so just put in, and I'll come to the way forward. The next slide. Issues of the IMF program. The only reason I'm referring to it is because that is really not the passion. To me, the IMF, frankly, has done very little or hardly any learning of lessons over the last 22 programs. Part of the problem is that the programs tend to be cluttered with too many performance criteria. These are 40-year-old challenging structural issues, and we think that they can be resolved in 3-year programs. And the IMF program is typically for 3 years. Impossible, frankly, to do it in 3 years, unless you focus on just 1 or 2. They underestimate the complexity of the political economy of reforms. And this is something that I will also refer to a little later. The issues of institutional capability to implement the reforms, something that Abid struggles with much more while sitting in government committees, and the sustained political and social support that you need for something like this. Thirdly, they underestimate the challenges which come when both domestic is of course political as well as economic, and external circumstances change, because they underestimate the challenge of adjusting the extent, the pace, and the sequencing of reforms. And of course, I'm not going to talk about what I've been spoken about, which is the role of the Western countries in influencing the way the fund behaves, but let me not go into that. These are all well known. So what are some of the other short-term and medium-term initiatives that we need to take? I think it's fairly clear that some of them will require further containment of imports, and not just essentially looking at the interest rate and the exchange rate. The cash margins will have to probably cover a wider range of commodities. We probably have to think in short-term bans on some items like cars, cell phones, etc. Admittedly, the coverage for these items, of the ones that I'm referring to for short-term bans, is less than 10%. Inflation under the IMF program, because I know that's something David spoke about, some of the initial work that we've done, suggests that the average for the year will cross 11%. The average for the year will cross 11%. That's for sure. Likely to be closer to 14% for the remaining part of the year. So yes, the impact for middle class and poor, those with fixed earnings, is going to be a tough one. GST integration to lower the cost of doing business, which is both the provinces and federal government, just to make sure goods and services are taxed in the same way. Starting should have been with Punjab and KPK, where PTI has government, and the lowering of the cost of business could have a huge demonstration effect for the others to follow. The pricing of energy needs to be on a marginal cost basis now that you have, frankly, surplus power. And you need just make sure that you price it at a level where you can generate more demand. At least that will contribute toward the capacity payments. Rollover of our famous Chinese and Islamic Development Bank, UE deposits, And of course, the Saudi deposit, if ever we receive it, they have to be rolled over. Whether our friends in Saudi will ever agree to a rollover again, I just wonder. Finally, a more important something blasphemous that I want to say. I cannot see how we will be able to fully service our debt. And I'm really at the moment focusing on the domestic debt, the interest payments on it, and our obligations to the IPPs. Mining beneficiaries of these receipts will have to take some kind of haircut. The nature and extent really needs a more detailed examination. We're living in a dream world, I mean, domestic debt, interest payments are now 2.8 trillion. Some of it, of course, comes back from the state bank profits, but nevertheless, there's something which is not really a sustainable way to look at things. Chinese IPPs present a problem simply because the contract was signed more recently, 2016-17, and may have to be dealt with differently. One has ideas as to how that could be done, get something else in return rather than renegotiate. They're not going to renegotiate, so maybe something else we can get as a part, a replacement part substitution. We need to recognize that we are a federation. And so the roles of the CCI, the NEC, and the parliamentary committees need to be made more effective, frankly. Businesses require policy predictability, not consistency. I should know what the government is planning to do. Otherwise, I will have a short time horizon. And our plea, governments generally have a plea that, so governments are always firefighting, we know this. But you somehow expect that the government has the privilege or should have the license to be able to think in the short term, but the private sector should take a long term. This is not possible. The signals have to come from the government, must come from the government for the private sector to take a long term. The predatory behavior of state institutions, which are incentivizing informalization and damaging investor sentiment. We need to strengthen efforts to improve agriculture yields, really neglected the agriculture sector, and we can't keep complaining that this is a provincial subject, because we are the ones who also, at the federal level, end up getting subsidies to the fertilizer sector. So we now can leverage the kind of subsidies you give and the investments you make. We need to raise investments, water conservation, water development. It amazes me when I look at the PSTP. It's only roads. We're not producing anything, but we are more interested in that roads. And you just look at the PSTP and the portfolio of roads. Focus efforts on SMEs, associated policy measures with actually supporting inclusiveness. Well, I'm a great supporter of SMEs, but one thing which bothers me, and I'm just flagging it for half a second. You see, the SME sector is a low value producer and has low productivity. My fear is that under the pressure of globalization, under the pressure of donor programs of greater opening up of the economy, greater liberalization and deregulation, their ability to compete with global products, so if nothing else, the Chinese, and so my fear is that they could actually be wiped out. So, whereas I'm a great supporter that there is a need to actually defend the SMEs because they are the most labor absorptive in our system. My fear is whether they will be able to compete under a challenging environment requiring us to more open up the economy. The pace of change that is taking place, I will tell you, is frightening. How you reorient government to think differently, away from investment in hardware, as an enabler of technology, because it is disrupting activities of production, goods and services, and the type of jobs that are being created. I know people keep referring to productivity. I often ask myself, much of the increase in productivity is not coming through better machines, but much more through product innovation. You see, I mean, you and I carry cell phones. I mean, the kind of product innovation that and the productivity that has produced has nothing to do, frankly, with having a better machine. So this part of product innovation is obviously at this stage beyond our realm. How do we create an environment for opportunities, support innovation, technology, transition to digital economy, easier said than done? Today I picked up from a webinar conducted by BIDE. The argument was use available spectrum for accessing the internet and don't look at the bandwidth as a source of revenue. The second, we all know, improve connectivity by reducing taxation on hardware and particularly length of fiber optic cables. Use technology to facilitate developer regional trade. Vakar, most better than all of us, has spent ages looking at the kind of the arrangements and the institutional structures, the instruments, and the policy measures designed by FBR to prevent smuggling of non-transit trade. But really today, thanks to technology, thanks to accessing, say, the Chinese exporter and what gets comes into our ports and the under-invoicing, that all can be avoided thanks to technology, and that can actually help facilitate and develop regional trade. Revamp tax structure. I'm sure Faktola will think better than I can. Dr. Pasha has done a lot of work that we've done jointly, but he's done more of it. And we've talked about it, we've written about it, much of the work has been reflected in the business recorder, really focusing on the number of instruments and, of course, more importantly, reducing the range of rates that we have at the moment. And, of course, eliminate, should rate, anti-export bias. So to participate in global supply chain, what do I mean by that? There are only two types of things. One is the producer-driven chain. Mera, Samsung, Sony का television बिकता है, Polo की कमीज बिकती है. You and I can't sell it. We can only be part of it. We should be. And the other is really the buyer-driven chain. And what do I mean by that? Walmart बेचता है, Amazon बेचता है, Alibaba बेचता है, Mera भी बेचता है. So you have to be part of those two key chains to be able to generate the kind of money that you think that you want to. And of course, the services sector, we're beginning to see growth in that area. The private sector, the role of the private sector in this is equally, if not more important. Finally, what makes a country tick? It's not that easy to copy countries. If it was that simple, there would be 20 Chinas by now in the world. Every country has its own political economy that one has to deal with, the institutions and so on and so forth. We all know, just to remind ourselves that we've been living on borrowed time way beyond our means for far too long. And then let us not forget, we are too large a country for anyone to help. So 20 million, किसी के पास इतने पैसे नहीं है. 220 million की आबादी के लिए, 200 million की आबादी के लिए वो आपके लिए पैसे नहीं करते. Much of the discussion I find is really around symptoms, not key issues. It's like treatment of blood pressure when someone needs surgery. The surgery, unfortunately, will have to be done by local doctors and here. ये patient बाहर नहीं लेके जा सकते, जो कुछ होना है इधर ही होना है. And how we do it, the kind of reform, because most of the problems are deep-seated, entrenched, it's structural. How do you distribute that pain equitably based on different economic classes to be able to bear the burden is the real challenge. Because the sacrifices that will be required and the discipline that will be required in a country like ours, the Pakistan of today, your guess is better than mine, and it will be done. Key factors, a fairly enlightened elite, I deliberately put elite in quotes, because I think I often wonder what the definition of the word elite is. And it's a discussion that we should someday have. We use it quite loosely, including myself. We need a broader consensus on priorities, policies, incentive structures, instruments, institutions. Does it mean a new social contract? That's another word that keeps coming out of the press. I don't know. The formidable challenges for inclusive growth is participation, stakeholders, and less and more important, because this is something I referred to earlier, that we be unable to give the majority of the population the kind of education and the skills for them to be able to participate in the growth process that we are now seeing. For that, you need a less corrupt and broadly more competent and efficient system of the public delivery of basic, decent economic and social services. And I'm focusing much more on things like health, clean drinking water, very basic stuff. Where the priorities come in, and of course, needless to say, much more importantly, education. I mean, between the upper middle classes and the rest, the division between their children and those of less affluent or relatively is they've been divided by concrete walls. They can't climb up all the walls. I can never forget one little incident. Ages ago, I was sitting with Asma Jangir in a car, and she immediately asked her driver, So the point was that for him, the future, as he saw it, for his son, was no social mobility, but remain a driver. Because the kind of education that we are providing will not be able to give them the kind of social mobility that is required. Finally, can this be done? Short, medium, long term? I'm sure your guesses are far better. Your analysis is far better than mine, whether it can ever be done even in the long term. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir. A very excellent keynote, and it's really a tough task to pick up any points for emphasis, because every point was so emphasizing in itself. For example, if I can see the last point, the social mobility. In Pakistan, data tells that if you are born to a driver, born to a dishwasher, there is a 50% chance that you will end up being a driver of the dishwasher. So your fate in the job market is half of it is decided the moment you are born. So that is the level of immobility that is in Pakistan, and that really speaks how inequitable the opportunities to excel in education, health, labor market are. And this is where the inclusive growth or the agenda of inclusive growth becomes very central, that there are two equations to any growth. What kind of opportunities are being produced, and where are those opportunities going actually, who is benefiting from those? And so this is where social equity, and one point also that I would like to highlight before I move to the panel discussion, that is the population growth, the challenge of population growth. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, the population policy or the social policy has become a residual policy. We take it, we have kind of disenfranchised itself from the macroeconomic policies. And that is one of the biggest challenges. And if you have time, do read sometime Bangladesh story. The one of the key success was controlling their population growth. The Excel sustainable economic growth period started when the population growth declined to around 1% compared to Pakistan, where it's 2 point some percent and fertility rate is very high. And the final point on the emphasis that do have your own research reform agenda. Pakistan unfortunately has a history of involuntary reforms, or you can say the forced reforms, which are definitely by design to be half-hearted and done in haste, which compromises the gains and increases the cost. So thank you so much for a very detailed list of challenges and the way forward. So now this brings us to the second part of today's discussion, and that is what we call the panel discussion. And one point that Dr. Shahid Kardar Sahab has highlighted, that expenditures take over the taxation, the revenues. And there is a discussion that what comes the first? Is it the revenue first? And then you will see the expenditures. I mean, you will invest based on your fiscal space, the revenue space. Or the second approach is that you invest in human, you invest in the people, they create fiscal space by increasing the productivity, and this is where expenditure take the lead. So within this counter to the expenditure is the tax revenues. So let me invite Ashfaq Tola Saab for his thoughts on the taxation reforms in Pakistan. Over to you, sir, please. Thank you. Can you play slides of Ashfaq Saab, please?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Shahid Kardar Sahab, distinguished panelists, guests, economists, student of economy like me, distinguished media person. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's really a very difficult topic, the tax reforms in Pakistan. I think it is almost a 50% damn story, because we form so many commissions, we have formed so many committees, we have got so many programs to deal with. But when it comes to implementation, the result is zero divided by zero. So when it comes to speaking on tax reforms, it is really a gigantic task. Let's begin on a lighter note, and let me take you through a journey of tax reforms in Pakistan and look through the historic perspective, and then I'll just nip in the bud about the recent issues which we are facing, the tax reforms. First of all, on the lighter side, let's begin with the quote of Senator Russell Long, when he said in 1975, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the fellow behind me." So this is really a true story of tax reforms for all of us. And we always speak about taxing some segment of the society which is not taxed. And that is a true analysis as well, because taxation is all about equity. Unfortunately, in this part of the region, taxation is something which we look from a different perspective, especially in the last 1 decade or so. Our primary focus is that tax should drive the economy and not economy the tax. So we are moving in a reverse direction. And that reverse direction leads us to nowhere. I can just go through the manifestos of all the political parties, and whenever they print their manifesto before the elections, they simply say that we will do the tax reforms. And they do so. But when it comes to implementation, the results are not sufficient. As far as Pakistan is concerned, we have got so many programs which we have done in the past, and we have pursued it. I think I'll take it simply, what is the issue? We have started with Tax Reforms Committee in 1990-1991, and their focus was exemption. It was basically just to enhance the tax base by withdrawing exemptions, credit and allowances, simplification of tax laws and procedure, greater accountability of tax officer, and strengthening of regulation. Just look at each and every bullet item of this committee, and you will find that these problems still exist. We are already ring-fenced those problems in 1990, 1991, yet we have not resolved it. And it took us almost 31 years now, and still we are standing there. So, in my humble view, this is a failure on our part. And as rightly said by Dr. Saab, is it a deliberate attempt or is it simply a nuisance? Is it a mismanagement or we are naive or we don't want to do it? Next committee, I mean, it was from the 1991 era of, and then 1995, 1996. Phase one, we have developed 5 types of withholding taxes. It was a very small and a very ring-fenced withholding regime. And now, if you go through that ordinance, Income Tax Ordinance 2001, it is nothing but a bunch of legislation which entails and which can explain you about the withholding taxes. And even we are the only jurisdiction in the world, I think, to the best of my knowledge, out of the 40 jurisdictions, I have studied, we are the only jurisdiction in the world that we have got withholding tax on sales tax. It is a unique phenomenon. I have never heard of it. So this is something that needs to be addressed. Then second phase was basically expanding and taking into net the agricultural tax, capital gain, services, and informal sector. What is informal sector? Where is agriculture tax? We have got an agriculture tax, which is basically governed by the provinces. They have got their legislation, but what is the enforcement? And I'll take you to the next slide where I have explained the numbers, so you can easily understand what is the performance as far as these taxes are concerned. Capital gain, yes, we have introduced that in, I think, 2011. So taxes on services is there since 2001. And informal sector. What is informal sector? If we deliberately give an opportunity to enhance the base of our parallel economy, which is almost 100% of what we have. This is my estimate, and I mean, there are different estimates available, but in my humble view, and my team has suggested me that it is 100%. So if we are talking about 48,000 billion of parallel economy, how to bring that economy to tax? This is called informal sector. Can we double the taxation by introducing informal, by translating informal economy into the formal stream? No. We have to graduate that. And we have got a solution. I'll present that. These are something, as Dr. Saab has said, Kardar Saab has said, that eliminating all or most of the tax expenditure, this was what they have decided in 1995 and 1999. To eliminate tax expenditure and tax holidays. It is still there, and if I am not wrong, it is again part of the MEP to remove the exemption. So the journey started in 1995 and we haven't finished it. This still exists. The next is moving from presumptive taxes to more adequate and systematic taxation of personal and corporate tax. Again, we are lingering on and we are banging on presumptive taxes, withholding taxes, and we were supposed to eliminate them in the last century. Still, we have got our taxation regime full of presumptive. Yes, we are gradually eliminating them, but still this is not good form of taxation. The reason is we have never moved with the world. Our IT system is too weak. This is what we have suggested in last tax reforms. first phase was, as I said, that it was introduced in 1991, finance sector. Then there was another committee or a commission of tax reforms in 1997, 1998. ये वही राग अलाप रहे थे, and still those programs exist. So then we have formed a task force on tax administration. उसी को अगर हम एमिनेट करते हैं तो वर्ल्ड बैंक से हमने एक प्रोग्राम दिया था टार. It was a very comprehensive program. But let me tell you, the premise of that program, the foundation of that program was absolutely wrong. We have made a different and a new code under the name of Income Tax Ordinance 2001. And that was introduced when the previous code, which was Income Tax Ordinance 1979, was almost mature to be enforced on all segments. By changing the code, we have changed the entire dynamics of the taxation. And one of the reasons which we are lingering behind, and we have never updated ourselves according to the requirement of economy, is just the impediment is Income Tax Ordinance 2000. We have spent 90 million for updating the software, and still we are lingering on. We are much behind what the world has done as far as IT is concerned for the taxation systems. 54 million government. We have made softwares, PRAL, or PRAL, it is 10. So in my humble view, we have achieved something, but we have not achieved the desired result of TAR. And we end up paying $120 million to the world, because that was a technical assistance that was not a grant. So, sir, we have paid 120 million. It was a wasteful, I think, money, which was concluded. There was different IRS and customs. So, sales tax regime was given to IRS, which was previously governed and controlled by a different department of customs. And again, we end up in litigation between IRS and customs people. Result is 0 divided by 0. TAR pended in 2011. I was part of that team which concluded that program. And Dr. Abdul Rafi Sheikh, Dr. Pasha was there, Masood Naqvi Saab was there, myself, Shabbar Zaidi Saab, we all were there. Bashir Ali Mohammed Saab, Rashid Mary. Tax Reforms Commission 2016. In the last regime, another Tax Reforms Commission was made. It was basically in 2014, but the report was submitted in February 2016. We have done a lot of work, and the basic Masood Naqvi Saab was the chairman, and I was part of it. We authored a report of was considered as one of the best reports on tax reforms by none other than the World Bank. We took a commitment from the then government that we will work very hard on it, we will monitor it, but just form an implementation committee to implement those reforms. And accordingly, an implementation committee after a lapse of 10 months was formed. But unfortunately, the enforcement, because of the mindset, has never been done. So these were the broad brush guidelines, and I think a scope of work for the terms of reference of that committee. This presentation is available with the STPI, and I think you can obtain from them. If you want, we can share it with you. Dr. Saab, participants in this one. Thank you. अब इसमें अगर आप देखेंगे तो ये वही प्रोग्राम and वही list, same old list. All tax reform, elimination of presumptive tax regime, and everything. Just go through. Maybe a 2 fancy bullets here and there. So What we realized in 1990, we have never resolved those problems. We have identified them. We know how to kill them. But still they are on board. And what is the reason? Why is it so? It is because of the mindset. It is because of the fact that in other jurisdictions, the tax targets are not set like what we are doing in Pakistan. Our recipe of tax target is totally different. We make an expenditure budget. So this is the total expenditure. Then we say this much IMF will allow us as fiscal deficit. Now this much is left. How much non-tax revenue we can earn? And finally we say, come what may, this we have to achieve through tax collections. We don't look at the inflation numbers. We don't look at the GDP growth. What we do is simply just make this fill in the blank as a tax target, and we say the balance will be achieved through tax administrative, which remain undefined. And most of the time, we fail to achieve the target unless either we have got inflationary economy or we bank too much on imports. Because we don't have any surplus, exportable surplus. My export, I can show you the analysis, is ranging from 23 billion to 26 billion or maybe 25 billion. It is just because of the commodity pricing and not the quantity. So quantity remains static, maybe because of the top and huge investment in the textile sector is comprising of 65% of my total export. This time we may find some better result. And let's pray and let's hope for that. These were the lists which we identified और हाथों से लिखी हुई रिपोर्ट बाद में हमने टाइप ये सारी चीजें. This is the diagnosis we have made. Lack of consideration for value and integrity. We all know. Underperformance, serious underperformance by the IT support and IT backbone of VR, which is being provided by PRAL. PRAL is standstill. We need to move. I went to Turkey. We have seen there that they have outsourced the major softwares for collection of tax, and they pay as an incentive. Total AI-based softwares, and this is what I'm talking to you of 2015. Total software AI-based, and they are collecting and they are performing astronomical. No comparison. But we are of the view that we are the best in the world. And if, God forbid, sometime IRS of US fails to deliver, they will seek our help or PRAL's help to help them. So I don't think, I mean, this is the mindset. We need to change that. There's so many other factors. Exemptions. According to a report of Dr. Hafiz Pasha, which he, I think, released in 2016 or 17, tax expenditure worth 830 billion rupees were in existence in the tax codes, including sales tax, FED, customs, and income tax. So we have suggested that we should eliminate them. Income tax में क्या issues से, sales tax में क्या issues से. If I go into detail, मेरा ख्याल है मुझे 2 घंटे लगते. So I'm just flipping. FED में क्या आता है? Customs. In 10 or 11 items alone, the smuggling drone items. This is a report by the customs itself that Pakistan is losing at that time. In those items, we were losing some $2.2 billion, which is 9.4% of our revenue. Wow, you can understand if we can use this much, only 10 to 12 items, then what is the total quantum of smuggling and how we are losing and how much we are losing. And where we can gear it up, we can just translate those smuggling into the mainstream economy and we can improve our revenues. Avenues of tax evasion. This is the main issue. And this is where we need to control. Price points. Now we are clipping it. नीचे आ रहे हैं, and this was our advice. And alhamdulillah, both the previous regime and this regime, both of them are very cordial and very cooperative about it. And the price points we are now getting registered, maybe because of IMF pressure as well. Then we have got property files. This is a unique jurisdiction in the world where we have property files. And you are aware of this fact, FBR value is say 10 million, the market value is 40 million. So government is losing revenue in that, and we had provided an opportunity or a window to create a parallel economy of 75%. This is something which is serious. And this is what we said that you need to clean it up. This is what FATF has said most of the time. And I think this is something which comprises 70% of my parallel. Commodities. People buy these commodities like gold, silver, and they keep them in their bank lockers. Even currencies, dollars, they are not depositing in their accounts. So this is a serious matter which government needs to think. We have extended 2-3 amnesties in the past, but still people are saying one more. Because of the fact, unless we close these avenues, I don't think we'll be in a position to clip the wings. How these other jurisdictions they have controlled. It's not Pakistan alone which is facing this serious crisis. India has faced a similar crisis. Turkey has faced a similar crisis. But how they have controlled it? They have made action plans. Here the action plans, and they said how to translate that parallel or grey economy into mainstream economy. They have incentivized. The recent program of Turkey, they are investing $700 billion just to achieve some 15% change of lines from parallel to mainstream. So this is the need of the hour. But unless we create an equity in the taxation system, it is not possible. We have got 20% economy as agriculture economy and 18% as retail and wholesale. 38% of my economy is contributing a little, even less than 2% of my direct taxes. So can you survive? Simple answer is no. If we take and extrapolate their contribution or maybe tentative contribution, they have to contribute 890 to 920 billion, which is almost 1.5 or maybe 1.5% of the GDP. अब हम बात करते हैं कि टैक्स टू जीडीपी हमारा इम्प्रूव, इट इज लिंगरिंग ऑन एट 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and we wanted to increase tax to GDP by 1% every year. It's an ambitious target. Because of the inflationary impact, you have to achieve some amount of increase in your tax revenue, obviously. But to increase 1 more percent means that you need to increase 500 million, half a trillion every year. And you don't have resources, you don't have tax revenues to impose such taxation. You can withdraw the exemption, that is one time. Then next time it will be difficult to find another avenue. Unless you create an equity, unless you tax agriculture income, it's true. I'm not saying tax the farmers. like you and me, we have been charged with taxation over and above certain limits. That should be equitable. There should be one agency of collecting tax, not so many. Maybe FBR can collect, or maybe a joint like clearinghouse sort of a situation can be made where each stakeholder, like provinces and FBR, they can be party to it, they can be shareholder or stakeholder of that, and they collect tax in a single window, and accordingly it has to be distributed. If we have 50 different windows, we'll never create an ease of doing business. We'll never create a tax culture, and we cannot enforce any law. So this is again this was our recommendation to make a national tax agency. This is what we have suggested, that TRC strongly recommend that a high-level committee to be set up. The action plan का हमने बात किया, to fight against the informal economy. When meaning that agriculture tax, parallel economy because of land issues and property issues होना चाहिए. And then agriculture sector and retail sector. This is what I have said, that we have only generated in 2018, we have generated 1.589 billion from all 4 provinces in agriculture as I mentioned. So do you think it is justified? A 20% economy is contributing 1.5 billion. तो एक कॉर्पोरेट का विदहोल्डिंग टैक्स बन जाता है हमारा एक क्वार्टर, इससे भी कम ज्यादा बन जाता है. So this justification is smuggling and under invoice, as I said, that 2.6 billion, 9.46 billion in only 12. So if we take the picture holistically, we can easily increase this 2.6 billion to 7 to 8 billion. This is an old report. I think they might have updated it. I don't know what is the recent figures. So this is something which we need to address. Action plan. You just need to make an action plan, and Alhamdulillah, we have IPA and ICAC, Institute of Chartered Accountants and Institute of Business. We have formed a joint research to just address this issue, along with another research on Kare, that is ease of making code of taxation. We want a separate code for small and medium enterprise and individuals, a very brief one like we have in Germany, and a complete code for the big ticket companies. So these require, I think, intellectual contribution from people like DPI or PI or maybe LAMS, IB, We need to address this, and we need to just propagate this. We need to just force government, I think, through various chambers, through various BBC or maybe OICCI, to enforce them, to create ease of business and increase your tax revenue and create an equity. Make an action plan. Convert your parallel economy into mainstream. इसमें आप देखें अगर automation is, as I'm saying, it is
so excellent presentation, but we still have 5 more speakers, so may I please request.
So this is something we wanted to address. Border security force, one force instead of so many forces. Thank you.
I'm sorry. So thank you so much for very excellent history, de-root tax reforms in Pakistan. And the most important point, and this is where I think the one of the key success criteria in Pakistan that has developed over the time, unfortunately, is maximizing tax revenues means good governance. It's good government if you can maximize the tax revenues, no matter where it is coming from. And this is where it is linked to the inclusive growth. Tax has a very strong distributional effect. indirect taxes create inequality. And this is what has been happening in the Pakistan throughout the history, that we keep relying on indirect taxation, we keep producing inequalities. And I think that moving forward, the progressive taxation will be a very key, the central point to have a very inclusive recovery from COVID-19 in it itself. And this is one of the biggest fear that while running for the fiscal space, developing countries like Pakistan may push more indirect taxation, which is already coming from. And one of the key sector, energy has been tapped as a revenue mobilization source. Petroleum prices has been become in Pakistan an easy way to meet the tax targets set exogenous to the economy, as Ashfaq Saab has already pointed. So this links to the energy sector, and let me invite Dr. Sardar Muazzam Saab for his thoughts on energy sector in Pakistan. But just we do understand that it is a difficult task to ask you a 10 decades issue to cover it in 10 minutes. But unfortunately, we are running out of time. We have so many audience there. So 10 minutes, please, if we'll request if you can wind up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just say a few words before I start. Yeah, I think the seniors before me, I think they have rightly pointed out many issues. And at the same time, I think this is also the challenge with the energy sectors. I think it will be very difficult, in fact, कि 10 मिनट में वो कवर किए जाए, और इवन अगर 2 घंटे भी लगा दी जाए तो it will be much different in that case. So one more thing, I think I'll just try to highlight that the mandate which I have in the government is more focused on energy efficiency and conservation. And this is the area where we sort of specialize and sort of have a mandate. So part of my discussion will be on that. But I think being a student and some of my previous research papers and some of the work I've done on the inclusive growth, that excites me a lot more. I just sort of highlight some of this discussion. Lastly, I think I taught in different places, and एक सवाल मेरा हमेशा ये रहता था कि आपको पता है कि एक माँ में और एक प्रोफेसर में क्या फर्क होता है? तो there was a very simple answer कि माँ एक वक्त में एक बच्चे को सुला सकती है और प्रोफेसर एक वक्त में सारी क्लास को सुला सकता है. So I will try not to make you sleep in the session and will make my best that आपको थोड़ा सा give you active. So I think I'll just start with this simple idea that when I look into the inclusive growth, and that the whole idea for me revolves around the distribution and redistribution of resources. And the challenge still remains that all those who are poor, can they get access to that resources? They will have ability to reach and have use of that resource. And I think from the growth, post-Washington consensus, to pro-poor growth, and all this dilemma is all about how we can do the redistribution of resources. And that is also the part I want to sort of highlight, that this is where I came up also in my PhD research, that how we can innovate the access. And this part of innovating the access always needs a creative destruction. That there will be sort of creative destruction. जब iPhone 6 आएगा तो iPhone 5 के साथ मुश्किल हो जाएगी. This will be a destruction along with this creativity. So I think given the energy sector where we are dealing with, access की भी different domains हैं, and that's how we see the distribution, which will lead to inclusive growth. For example, if we see there are access through different means, for example, infrastructure is one way. We have natural endowments, such as आप उस एरिया में लाया करते हैं where you have more solar irradiance, maybe then you have access to it. Infrastructure means you have access to grid. And then moving forward, there are other areas that how, as a management practices, as scientific best innovations, how we can bring that access or inclusiveness in this process, that way you can have access to energy. And then you will be more inclusive in that standpoint of view. So I think Sustainable Development Goal 7 has already defined that the way we see the energy sector is more of from supply standpoint of view. That we have generation, we have transmission, and then we have the distribution networks. Either it's power or a gas sector. But I think one of the factors which really helps us to understand that where is the consumer, where is the population, with the 28% access to gas and more than 90% access to electricity, still this access also comes into, or this is inclusiveness also has a challenge that how we can move forward. So I think already Kardar Saab has pointed out the challenges that we see in terms of the energy sector. I think if I ask anyone in this room or in anywhere, the first challenge which we always see that the pricing or the tariff regimes. And I think recently, whenever there is also always been part from the donor side, I have seen this challenge that the only thing which we as some of the economists thinks that how we can play with the tariff and somehow sort out everything around it. If you look at the basic, how we govern this whole framework, either in NAPRA, in OGRA, or overall framework is that we give, for example, aggregated commercial and technical losses. So aggregated is something which comes with commercial and technical losses. Commercial is something which goes to governance. And the technical is something where we can do something. And I think this is where the underlying principle of efficiency comes in. That how we can play around it, how we can effectively work on that. Same goes with the, when OGRA talks about there's another aspect that UFG, unaccounted for gas losses. So structurally, again, this is unaccounted for. How much is the loss? How much is the theft? That is the kind of the challenge which we are facing. I think another, the pricing needs, I believe, because there are a lot of things in that if we can start discussing it, it will take me a long time, but just to scratch the surface and sort of point out some of these things. Another important aspect which I think we see is the demand and supply gap. And you will see the challenge of this demand and supply in terms of seasonality. In winters, I think we have shortage of gas and we are already somehow facing it. In summers, there are days when we have a lot of demand for electricity and sometimes couldn't meet that demand. Now the challenge between both of these seasons is that how effectively we can design, and all those demands which goes higher than the base load is how we can do the peak shaving. So this is where the demand side energy management comes in. And I can tell you for sure that from last decades, we have not done any work on demand side management, except one thing, load shedding. We managed the demand through the load shedding. And that's how these things are working. And that's how we are addressing our peaks whenever we have the seasonal challenge. So this is sort of overall context where the challenges are, where the problems are. I think the next important thing for me is when I look into the sector is that how these organizations are structured. That governments owns these entities, that if these are discos or SNGPL, and then the government's own regulators are sitting between them. So it sort of gives me the sense as a student of policy that there is a conflict of interest, because somehow with this exercise, the regulator cannot be strengthened, because we always have to somehow deal with these distribution companies on the both sides. So I think it's also important that can we run the utility business, compare it anywhere in the world, I think, and that's, we have the understanding in this government as well, that utility businesses is something should be privatized or outsourced. But then I think it has its own political economy of reforms, that how effectively we can sort of deal with this kind of challenge, that this retail markets can be developed, and this whole spot markets, and especially on the power sector, there are a number of challenges also with this kind of mechanisms of take and pay, take or pay sort of issues can be designed in a way. So I think these are identified issues in that way. So if we just go back a little and discussing about the way forward, I'll just say a few points here, that access, the primary thing, that we have to ensure access for all, though there are different degree of access, but that's one point. Second, which we as per SDGs understand, the renewables, which is a key, I think, in the current agenda across the world and for this government as well, that how we can increase the share of renewable energy. And you will see very innovative mechanisms that are coming along, such as net metering, such as other power plants, which renewables, hydro, wind, solar, and hybrid kind of solutions. And I think this also, if you look at different documents such as IGCEP and others, which already provides us with this kind of information, like what is the plan in this time horizons. And renewables in itself provides a lot more support in terms of when we talk about inclusiveness, because if you go to the marginalized area where the access through the infrastructure was not available, this renewable energy is making energy access possible, and this makes it more inclusive in terms of the economic growth. So renewables aligned with the climate change agenda also provides us this overall framework, where solar provides us much more a framework of inclusive growth. Now, I think there is this agenda also comes with the climate change mitigation part, and how we are sort of dealing with the climate change, and how much is the cost for an ordinary farmer or anyone in any space in marginalized areas. Their income goes into the energy procurement or the use of energy. So this is one of the research which I did myself, almost 50% for a normal agriculture farmer goes into that area. So I think this also entails with this climate change mitigation part. That's how we can deal with, on one side, on the energy sector and renewables, and then also with this climate change mitigation. I think when I talk about climate mitigation part, this is very important. It's how this organization, which can be very useful, or maybe the concept of energy efficiency and conservation, that could have played a major part in last 2 decades, or even more than that, has been missing from the global agenda, or from even in countries' context. From the energy landscape, I think we have always been focused on producing more or generating more energy, and we have never thought about energy efficiency. And it's proven that producing one energy unit is way more expensive than saving one unit of energy. So, but this sort of approach in the overall energy planning policy, that has not been effective. Compared to Pakistan, I think if you look in India, in Japan, in other countries, their frameworks, the way they have worked on these areas, they have done a tremendous job in that case. I think recently in one of the research which conducted by SDPI, it's a very interesting research which shows that if $1 spent on fossil fuels, that will create one job. If $1 spent on renewables, that will produce 7.2 jobs. And if $1 spent on energy efficiency and conservation, that will produce 7.5 jobs. So in this case, the way we see this kind of a challenge, that how the employment can be generated and how far-reaching it will be and more inclusive, I think that is the area which International Energy Agency in the COVID time highlighted this point as well, that in COVID recovery, most of the investments in Europe for recovery was all more focused on energy efficiency and conservation. So that's what I think is important to sort of conclude with this sort of approach, that we always sort of think that innovation and access to technology is sort of thing which we look for whenever we go for inclusive growth. And technology plays its role. And then some of these other aspects plays important role, but how we can sort of address this challenge that on one side we have growth and then poor remains out of it, and they cannot be incorporated to make it more inclusive. So I think that redistribution challenge always needs in any sector, either it's energy or other. I believe that how we can innovate the access to make it more of inclusive growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muslim sir, bringing us on how to innovate to promote access in energy sector. And let me now, without any further kind of taking the time, invite Javed sir for his thoughts on business regulations in Pakistan. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's almost 1 o'clock already, so I can imagine you're probably all low on sugar and struggling to follow this. So I'll try to keep it brief as much as possible. Just very quickly, I've been billed as Chairman NAFTAC and various other things, but one of the more important things which I'm recently doing is an independent advisory group. It's called the Economic Advisory Group, which is just a group of friends, economists, including Dr. Bakar, who's sitting there, Dr. Ahmed Pizada, and we sort of deliberate about various issues which I don't often thought about in Pakistan. And I think it's very critical that we actually address some of the issues which normally don't get covered enough in Pakistan. So it's not simply about business regulation, it's really about the transformation that needs to take place in Pakistan if it's ever to have the kind of GDP growth that we need to do. So what is Economic Advisory Group? I said it's really a group of friends, a number of policymakers, a number of academicians. There's Ahmed Pizada, who I personally think is a future Atif Mayor in making. There are other people, Samir Pizada, Samir Ahmed, you must have heard the name. But anyway, we keep thinking about these. These are some of the people. The one good thing you will see, there's a good gender mix there as well. So I think it's very important that in anything that we do, we have enough women participating, because their views are just as, not only just as important, are critically important to any thought reform. We've been working also with, not that, but one wants to both with the Planning Commission, and some of the thoughts we have presented have hopefully some or the other manage to have an impact within the planning commission. But really, one of the things that Pakistan, if you look at it, is basically the structural makeup is ossified. It's really not going anywhere. World has transformed immensely. Pace is not only changing, but it's accelerating. The policy framework that we have is one towards only thinking in terms of growth, but that's the critical problem. We just keep talking about growth. It's not growth what we need. What we need is a sophistication, increased complexity of our economic structure. Growth is not enough. If we keep doing the same thing in the same boring products, we actually will get nowhere. So I think it's important to change the mindset. I think Sardar Sahib mentioned, other people mentioned, it's really important to think in terms of mindset. And for that change, what you really need is change in capabilities. And capabilities is not simply a question of more factories, more spindles, more power stations. It's a capabilities of intellect, it's a networks, it's the social fabric within the society. Capabilities is a very complex thing, and that is where the intelligent governments actually make it possible. So we really need to replace the old-fashioned industrial policy thinking towards a much more incentivizing, value-seeking, and productive behavior within the economy. So I think I can, having said that, I can move away because we're already short, but I will just take a few more slides. This is just an exciting slide. It's lots of fun things. You can have it, look at it. But this is from the Harvard Growth Lab. It talks about the complexity. What you'll see in Pakistan is really clustered around green. This is textile products, and that's all we do. We basically very basic agricultural textile products. Whereas if you see things like Vietnam, there's blue, green, there's all sorts of very interesting colors, and it's spread all across. And that's because the diversity of the economy has grown much more. This is Pakistan. This is a very important chart. 20 years back, you see it's all green. Virtually all green, a bit of rice, a bit of leather aprons. To 2019, hardly any different. Look at Vietnam. Again, a lot of commodities in 2019, completely different. Blue stuff, very exciting stuff. Electronics, complex products. They're making satellite engineering stuff. They're exporting to NASA. Where is that? In Pakistan, there's hardly any of that. That is the difference. This is where we have lost out. Pakistan has basically remained static, whereas other countries have moved on. There's another more even depressing chart. This is a chart, 1995 complexity index. Pakistan was 102. Today, it's 99. Vietnam, 107 in 99. Today, 52. And this means the productive capacities, the productive capabilities in Vietnam have dramatically changed. And that is what we need to be thinking about, not simply, again, GDP growth. In fact, our GDP growth capability is falling. It used to be around 6% in the 80s. It's fallen to about 3.8%. Anytime it goes beyond 3.8%, we run into all sorts of difficulties, balance payments crisis. The other problem with complexity and the lack of it is that it's is a very strong predictor of future growth. The lower the complexity, the lower the sophistication, the less ability you have for growth. It's a better predictor than just about any other economic indicator they have found. So this is something I'm afraid, Abid Suleria, I wish you get included in EAC. We really need to think about economic complexity as a form of critical measurement of where we're going in the country. This is just further reflection of what I was saying. You can see Pakistan, generally boring house linen products, Vietnam, much more interesting blue stuff, but really it's reputation. But here's there's something which I wanted to see somewhere where in Pakistan between 2003 and 2018 added about 14 products in terms of exports. Of those 14 products, per capita increase of those 14 products was only $2. In the case of Vietnam, there was something like 48 products, and I may get those numbers precise, but they're there in the document. It was $1,005 that they added per capita. That was the difference. And that was how economic complexity works. Now, why are we not transforming? It's basically something which Shahid said. There's no ability to transform. We need to be able to transfer our resources. Our resources are stuck in the same old products. In dealing with your change of capabilities, what you need to do is remove the barriers of reallocation of resources. And there's enough studies. In Mexico, they increased their productivity by 43% between 2003 and 2009, simply by removing the barriers to the resource allocation. There's tons of 2003 to 2010. So sorry, I lied. But there's tons of studies, and we can provide that. So we really need to think in terms of what are the restrictions in actually preventing resource to be reallocated to more productive, higher capacity, higher, more productive society, allocation. So I get their list of things. It's human resources, excessive government regulation against and there's investment in human resource, adequate social security, protecting of environment, etc., etc. We can go on about it. I'm not going to. I mean, one of the key areas is the sugar industry. I don't want to talk about it because it becomes political. But one of the things we don't think about the sugar industry, this is a highly regulated industry. Just from the point where sugarcane is planted to the point where it's allowed to be crushed, every aspect of it is regulated by the government. So how do you expect new efficiency to come in a sector that probably shouldn't exist anyway in Pakistan? So the other thing you find is, what are the sectors that are doing well? Most of those sectors which have very high effective rate of production, food for instance, 200. I know, forgive me, but there's things like Nestle and all this, we love them. But one of the reasons they're here is not because they're seeking efficiency in our economy. They're loving the protection that we provide them. It's the protective barriers. All the companies, the international companies that come to Pakistan are not coming here because they're seeking efficiency and to be able to re-export. They are just seeking the protective barriers that we provide them. And we need to think about this thinking process that we really need to focus on. Same with, we keep giving the same textile products to do the grape cloth, the 20-count yarn. We give them the same subsidies again and again, just so that they can grow. And there's very little incentive to change, to improve the sophistication or to improve the complexity of the products. So we can keep going along this way. So what are we saying? The way ahead is to incentivize sectors which are more productive, more sophisticated, higher standards, product sophistication, market penetration, human skill development, overcome this limited scale of domestic market. That is key. I mean, we are not integrated. This is something I've not had a time to talk about. In terms of global integration, we are one of the lowest among large countries. Our total exports to GDP is less than 10%. Most developed countries like ours are more than 40%. Within the region itself, it's probably less than 5%. So really, we need to think in terms of integration. Without integration, really, there is little chance that we will grow. And we can talk about all sorts of wonderful things that have new housing schemes and whatever, but that will just be for our own country. We won't really start exporting. So integrate with the regional markets, revisit pricing regime. This is critical. Unless we start getting rid of all these price controls, price support systems. I know there are some which are holy cows which we can't touch, but there are others I'm sure we can touch and we should be touching. Well, this goes without saying, and this is an area close to me. We need to invest in youth, but not simply university education. This is an elitist society, and we only think in terms of university education. What we need to do is mainstream vocational training, skills training. That's where a lot of the investment happens. There are many less PhDs in Vietnam than Pakistan, I can tell you that. Yet Vietnam is exporting 350 billion today, and Pakistan is only exporting less than 30 billion, with many less PhDs. So it's not many more PhDs we need. We need people who can actually do the work. Then we stop needing to pick winners. What we need to do is reward those people who are innovators, who actually are bringing about change. I can go on. So that's really in brief. I think I've done it.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you very much.
So,
Please, I'd request SDPI to share this with as many people. And there's a document also that EAT has recently produced. I know I'm plugging my own stuff. Forgive me for that. I'm a salesman once upon a time. So please read this as well. Thank you very much.
thank you so much, sir. I mean, it's at least double thanks to you for being very in time and bringing very emphasis on exports. And we think that in terms of inclusive growth to enhance productivity, to create quality jobs in the required number, export sector will be the critical juncture. And this is where Pakistan has been struggling and on the stagnant. But I'll just pick on the one point on your investments in youth and women. And this links me to the last speaker of today's panel discussion. But I have just a quick announcement that after the Dr. Alia's presentation, we will be having a 10 minutes quick question answer section. So please keep your questions ready, very brief if you have, and then we will be asking Emane Shandana Sahiba for any concluding remarks on this discussion. So over to you, Dr. Alia, please. Dr. Alia has been the biggest voice of mainstreaming gender in economic policy. So please, over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, SDPI. Thank you, Dr. Sajid. And let me begin with a clarification. I'm no longer a member of the Economic Advisory Council. Yes, I was the only female member of the first ESC, which was formulated in 2018. And the next time around, when it was reformulated, there is no female representation in the ESC. And neither is there any female representation in the recently announced, I think it was announced yesterday, the Macroeconomic Advisory Group. So let me make this the first call to attention that for inclusive growth, we need inclusive decision making. Otherwise, we are just trying to skirt the issue that half the population of Pakistan does not matter in the inclusive growth process of Pakistan, which I'm sure that none of us would really like to believe in. The examples that we have heard of countries from all the worthy speakers are not the countries with female labor force participation rates like Pakistan. For those of you who do not know the numbers, and excuse me, Shahid Saab, I am going to talk about some important statistics because I think it is vital to get the message across that Pakistan 25% bar of having even a quarter of its female working age population in the labor force, which means that either they are employed or actively seeking work. So where are the 75% of the women who are in the working age group? They are so-called NEET, which is neither in employment or education or training. Can we afford that if we want to talk of inclusive growth? I mean, all the issues that we have discussed are as relevant for inclusive growth as the mainstreaming of women in the growth process. And where do we begin? Now, each one of you who is an economics student knows that when you start studying macroeconomics, what do you start off with? That there are three markets. There's the goods market, the money market, and the labor market. Why in Pakistan do we think that we can have macroeconomics and growth economics without an understanding of the labor markets of Pakistan? And all the issues that have been pointed out by the worthy speakers before me point to one important fact, that we have not mainstreamed either our women or an appreciation of the working of labor markets in Pakistan into our so-called macroeconomic frameworks. And I have been especially lucky and fortunate, I think, that I have had the privilege of participating in important policy discussions at important policy tables in Pakistan. And every time I have, taken the opportunity to flag this issue, that if we do not understand the labor force statistics of such a populous country as Pakistan, with such a huge youth population as Pakistan, then there is something wrong in the way that we are looking at solving our problems. Now, it is all right to talk about Vietnam and Pakistan, but I think we should be looking at what Vietnam did with its female population in order to achieve the position that it has in economic rankings. Even as Bangladesh celebrates its 50th year of independence from Pakistan, the only real flag that they are waving is that we have used the most important resource of our country, and that is the women of Bangladesh, to achieve the kind of growth that we did. So I don't think I need to stress this issue more. It's not an easy issue because we have neglected it for 70+ years of our existence, but I will keep on harping at it wherever I get a chance. I was also introduced as somebody who has done work on poverty and social protection. And yes, I am chairing the National Poverty Estimation Committee. We have come up with the latest available data-based estimates on national and provincial poverty and inequality, which has not been done before. I mean, we have had Gini coefficients estimated at the national level years ago, when we then abandoned any discussion of income and wealth inequalities in our policy documents, but we have done that. And also multi-dimensional poverty index, which reveals a wealth of information. And by the way, that MPI estimation is based on the 1920 PSLM data. So it is very, pertinent, timely information to be taken note of by the policymakers. However, I don't know how much of a listen we are going to get as a committee, but we have done what we were entrusted to do. Secondly, yes, I am involved with the Social Protection Initiative in Pakistan in terms of a specific group called the Labor Expert Group that was constituted to look into expanding coverage of social protection, and not COVID-related social protection. That came later. This was before that. So I must acknowledge that the government did have a focus on the need for a universal social protection coverage, especially covering the informal economy workers. And then as a result of that, there is what is called a Mazdoor Ka Ehsaas unit, which is now established in the Poverty Alleviation and Social Safety Division. And yes, we are looking at digital solution in terms of extracting data from the National Socio-Economic Registry to build a registry of informal economy workers of Pakistan. So yes, there are gains that we have, that academics and I will say activist academics like me have been able to make, but they are too few and too far dispersed. I would have wanted more women in the main economic, macroeconomic policy making, playing a role. And it is not justified to say, where are the women? If women are not given opportunities, if they are not mentored and trained to reach these decision-making positions, then it's never going to happen. You have to give the responsibility and you have to make the decision-making processes more inclusive. So, Madam Shandana, taking advantage of your position in the ruling government, I would request that you also should raise your voice when you see that, you know, especially because we are talking of inclusive growth over here, when you see these policy forums being constituted without a single woman being on the policy table, then the female parliamentarians should also raise their voices and, you know, make noise about the fact that Pakistan, being such an important player on the South Asian economic, socio-economic regional map, does not give, you know, weight to women's opinions. And I just one last point, because I see a lot of people who are in higher education sitting at these tables. Now we are almost closing the gap of enrollment at the tertiary level, which means that almost as many females are enrolled in our higher education institutions as males. In some disciplines, they are even more. Why do they drop out when they have to make the transition from the university to the workplace? That is an issue that I wanted the first Economic Advisory Council very much to address. I was called upon to write a paper for explaining this issue particularly, because there was this promise of giving so many jobs. And I mean, obviously, some of the jobs, I would have wanted at least half of the jobs to have gone to women. But I have to say with a heavy, heavy heart that no one was prepared in those corridors of power to give a hearing to what I had to present. So if we dismiss our main issues, how can we talk of inclusive growth? So, and secondly, I think we should have the courage to face the reality of data. And I know that poverty is such, and inequality are such, you know, awe-inspiring topics that before me, 2 male chairpersons resigned from the chairpersonship of the poverty committee because they said, we are not, you know, willing to face the music when the poverty numbers came out. So this is how it is. And I would want those poverty numbers and those inequality numbers and those NPI numbers to come out so that we can go forward from there. I mean, if we keep hiding behind the data that is telling us the realities of Pakistan, then we are not going to get anywhere. We have to brave up to the realities of the data, use evidence-based data to formulate our policies and take tough decisions. So I will leave it on that. And thank you very much, SDPI, for giving me this floor to voice my opinions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. And I'm sure that everyone under this roof echoes with you on stressing the inclusiveness of gender, inclusiveness of policies, and one of the key point that at SDPI we have been highlighting, and it is much more emphasized in 2020's population situation analysis of Pakistan that SDPI was part, that female labor force participation in good jobs will be very critical. It has a micro to macro implications from household income savings to productivity, and even your population growth control hugely depends on how conducive the environment for female labor force participation is. We have slight change. We will be taking questions after some concluding remarks from M. Shadda. Welcome, please. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. मुझे बताया गया था कि हमारे ऑडियंस में कुछ मेहमान हैं जिनको उर्दू नहीं समझ आती. I believe there are people here who do not speak Urdu, but I will request a little bit of leverage, so I may speak both languages. Is that acceptable? Thank you so much. ना मेरी उर्दू अच्छी, ना मेरी अंग्रेजी, पश्तो मेरी ज़्यादा बेहतर है, but पश्तो सबको समझ नहीं आ रही. So शुक्रिया जी SDPI, शुक्रिया डॉक्टर वकार, शुक्रिया मिसुले साहब. मेरा SDPI से बहुत पुराना रिश्ता है. जब मैं पिछले 25 साल पहले इस्लामाबाद में ही एक think tank में काम कर रही थी. I'm an accidental parliamentarian. Don't ask me how I got here. I was dragged and pulled and pushed and shamed into not doing my national duty. I always thought I've done my national duty, but anyways, here I am in front of you. Certain comments I will make simply in reference to my colleagues. Certain comments I want to make on my own. कुछ चीजें मैं सियासी भी कहूँगी, मुझे उसकी आप पहले से माजूद दे दीजिएगा, क्योंकि आप सियासत में आ गए हैं, थोड़ी बहुत सियासत करनी पड़ेगी. लेकिन जो जरूरी बात है, जो मैं चाहती हूँ कि आज हम इस मैसेज के साथ यहाँ से जाएं. मुझसे पहले जो 4 एक्सपर्ट्स ने बातें की, मेरी भी बैठे बैठे एक ट्यूशन हो गई, एक पढ़ाई हो गई, एक लर्निंग हो गई, और ऐसे लोग हर रोज सुनने को नहीं मिलते. सो थैंक यू SDPI, थैंक यू ऑल. It's quite good. Javed Saab is somebody I'd like to call a friend. हमारी सोच एक ही जैसी है तकरीबन. और अगर मैं आपको young Pakistanis में कहूँ तो मुझे माफ कर दीजिएगा. Unfortunately, according to global young parliamentarians, मैं उस ग्रुप में आती हूँ. Though I'm young by no stretch of the imagination. लेकिन जो कुछ जरूरी बातें डॉक्टर कादार साहब ने बहुत जरूरी बात की कि we have an exaggerated sense of national importance. यानी कि हमें पाकिस्तान को थोड़ा सा एक है कॉम्प्लेक्स के हम अपनी जरूरत से ज्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट है. एंड आई एग्री विद हिम. हम जब फैसले करते हैं एक ग्लोबल कॉन्टेक्स्ट में तो हम सोचते नहीं हैं कि हमारी अपनी अंदरूनी क्या हालत है. लेकिन आप में से यहाँ कितने पश्तून बैठे हैं? If I could ask a question, great. So you will understand when I say the following, कि us Pashtuns, if possible, have an even more exaggerated sense of importance of who we are, our place in history, and where we're taking this country. It is the truth. And I'll tell you where this comes from. Badshah Khan, there's a very good book written about him, in which he said that Pakistan and the Pashtun both suffer from one problem. And that problem is our geography. Unfortunately, we cannot change our geography. You are surrounded by the biggest dynasties in history. China, India, Persian dynasty, Afghan dynasty. So how phase hue? Why do you think CPEC is as controversial it is in the West? For us, CPEC is a godsend. But for others, it's a threat. Why? Why is suddenly Pakistan being punished for being part of CPEC? अफगानिस्तान में कंदूरी जंग हुई है. अफगानिस्तान 20 साल बाद जंग खत्म हुई है. सजा पाकिस्तान को मिल रही है. तो जितने यहाँ पे जवान दिमाग बैठे हुए हैं, आपको यही रिक्वेस्ट करूंगी, remember, it's never about religion, it's never about color, it's always about the economy. And who controls the economy of the world? Now, if you happen to be in the bad books, one group of countries, which is fighting with another group of countries, you are going to suffer what is called collateral damage. पिछले 40 साल से अगर पाकिस्तान में गंदी इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसीज बनती आ रही हैं, this is not a mistake, it was planned. अगर आपने गरीब को फकीर कर दिया है, ये कोई गलती नहीं थी, ये प्लान था. अगर आपने भूखे को फकीर बना दिया, सड़कों पे ले आए हैं, ये गलती से नहीं हुआ, this was planned. Students of economy, you must know that there is no such thing as an apolitical economic discussion or economic decision. Every decision you make about the economy will be political. The question is, who do you want to benefit? आपने मालदार को मजीद मालदार करना है, कि आपने मिडिल क्लास को मालदार करना है, कि आपने गरीब को मालदार करना है? उससे आपका फ्यूचर बनता है। और पिछले 40 साल के फैसले आप सबके सामने, इसी से ढका छुपा नहीं। If you'll allow me, I'm going to make a couple of figures. एक और बात डॉक्टर कारदार साहब की जिन्होंने कही जो जरूरी है मैं इसको एड्रेस कर दूं, उन्होंने कहा कि पाकिस्तान में अभी सॉवरेन डेट फेलियर नहीं हुआ, यानी जब हमारी हुकूमत खासकर आई 2018 में, हम उन ममालिक में से थे जिनकी एक लिस्ट थी ब्लूमबर्ग की कि ये 10 ममालिक दिवालिया हो जाए क्योंकि ये कर्जे नहीं दे पाएंगे टाइम पे। उनमें से एक वेनेजुएला भी था, उसका हो गया, ज़ाम्बिया भी था, उसका भी हो गया सॉवरेन डेट फेलियर, लेबनान भी था, उनका भी हो गया, हम बच गए। Naturally, I'm from PTI. I belong to Imran Khan's party. Naturally, मैं उनको credit दूंगी. Time will tell best. But अभी मैं खुद ज़ाम्बिया से हो क्या रही? I've witnessed and experienced sovereign debt failure. ज़ाम्बिया के election थे, मैं as an observer गई Commonwealth की तरफ से। जिस चीज से I think मेरी इंसानियत, मेरा इस्लाम, मेरा खातून होना, पाकिस्तानी होना, जिससे मैं हिल गई। एक छोटा सा बच्चा वेरी चेयरफुली, हम कॉन्वॉय में जा रहे थे, इलेक्शन कॉन्वॉय में, और वहां पे रास्ते में उन्होंने ग्रिल्ड वो रखे हुए थे चूहे, बड़े वाले चूहे नहीं थे, ग्रिल्ड रैट्स, they were serving them as lunch and dinner, and that's when I realized कि I as a Pakistani, मैं पार्लियामेंटेरियन हूँ, मैं पाकिस्तानी भी हूँ, और मैं भी अक्सर नाराज होती हूँ महंगाई पे, it's a mild way of saying it, लेकिन जब मैंने वो देखा कि sovereign debt failure क्या होता है, that's when I realized we are a lucky nation. We are going through trauma, financial trauma, economic trauma, FATF-related trauma, Afghanistan-related trauma, CPEC-related trauma. ये हमारे अपने बनाए हुए problems नहीं हैं, ये बाहर से आए। कुछ हमारे अपने भी हैं, जो मैंने आपको बताया 40 साल में mismanagement, जिस बात में मुझे सबसे ज़्यादा गम होता है। मैंने एक ट्रेनिंग की थी NDU में National Security Workshop. In that we found out that the only time in Pakistan's history of economic planning, the only time we had inclusive growth, यानी इसमें गुर्बत भी कम हो और लोगों की जेब भी भर जाए और inequality भी कम हो, यानी मालदार और गरीब में फर्क कम हो जाए, that was only during a military regime of General Ayub. Those 10 years you had economic inclusive growth. Inclusive growth में आपको एक example बताऊं। इस वक्त जो development index है लाहौर का, वो फ्रांस और स्पेन के शहरों से कंपेयर हो सकता है, और पाकिस्तान में जो 14 लो डेवलपमेंट इंडेक्स के शहर आते हैं वो सब के सब बलूचिस्तान है। बलूचिस्तान आपको गैस देता है, सोना देता है, सब कुछ देता है, और आपने बलूचिस्तान को क्या दिया? मैं बलोच नहीं हूँ। तो ये कहना कि जी लाहौर वालों ने लाहौर के लिए फैसला किया, ये और भी ऑब्वियस हो जाना चाहिए आपके। वही पंजाब है, लाहौर में 1,40,000 एनुअली PSDP से जाता है, फी का खर्चा होता है। उसी पंजाब में लिहाड़ी, विहारी, लैया, राजन, वहां पे 5,000 खर्चा होता है। ये फैसला कौन करता है मुझे आप बताएं? सिर्फ सियासतदान करते हैं? कौन करते हैं? मैं बिलावल भुट्टो साहब के साथ ज्यादा अग्री नहीं करती किसी भी चीज पे, एक्सेप्ट एक बात कि डेमोक्रेसी इज द बेस्ट रिवेंज। डेमोक्रेसी इज नॉट रिवेंज, डेमोक्रेसी इज अकाउंटेबिलिटी। मैं अपने गांव और लाइटर साइड पे जोक बताऊं कि मैं अपने गांव गई और जाती रहती हूँ हर वीकेंड पे, and I'm not an elected MNA per se, I'm a reserve, I'm a proportional representative. ये मेरे गांव में एक सफेद दाढ़ी बुजुर्ग ने मुझे बोला, मैंने उनको यही बोला जी मैं रिजर्व है, मैंने नौकरी नहीं करा सकती, पैसे नहीं है, मैं आपकी ये नहीं करा सकती, इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ है, एक्सपोर्ट्स है, पूरा मैंने स्पीच दिया उनको। तो मुझे आके से कहते बेटा अंग्रेजी ना बोले, या रिजर्व या MNA हो या नहीं हो, रिजर्व क्या होता है? बात तो उसकी ठीक थी। और उन्होंने जो दूसरी मुझे बात की जिसकी मैं इकोनॉमिक लिंकिंग पे आ रही हूँ, द नेक्स्ट थिंग ही सेड टू मी वाज कि अंडे और टमाटर इतने महंगे हो गए कि हम आपके घर पे वो फेंक भी नहीं सकते। So this is what your average Joe is going through. This is his reality. He doesn't care about PTI or People's Party movie. He doesn't care about export growth, which we have managed rather well. He doesn't even care that we've managed COVID very well. On the Economist Index, Pakistan leads the countries that have managed COVID and the macro economy. Inflation एक अलग चीज है, but Pakistan is leading on that. You look at your remittances, the amount of trust that the overseas Pakistanis are reposing in your broken economy is something to talk about. But having said that, the regular Joe doesn't care because it doesn't reflect on his dining table. It doesn't reflect in the school fees he has to pay. So we are at a crossroads. मैं डॉक्टर साहब की बात से एग्री करती हूँ, ख़वातीन की इंक्लूसिविटी के हवाले से गुर्बत की मैंने बात कर ली। इस वक्त लंदन में, यूके में, सादिक खान जो मेयर है, उन्होंने एक स्टेटमेंट की कि इतनी महंगाई बढ़ रही है, फूड इन्फ्लेशन, कि we've got to eat or heat, यानी आपको गैस चाहिए, उसके पैसे हुकूमत दे, कि आपने खाना खाना। 33% यानी हर किसी की बास्केट में अगर खाना 100 रुपए का मिल रहा था, आप 133 का हो गया। ये मैं आपको ग्लोबल फिगर दे। और पाकिस्तान वो बदकिस्मत मुल्क है कि 40 साल में हमने चीनी तो बना ली, लेकिन वहां बनाई जहां नहीं बनाती। चीनी वाले कभी गरीब नहीं हुए, चीनी वालों की कभी सब्सिडी नहीं रुकी, और चीनी वाले हर हुकूमत को, इंक्लूडिंग माई। सो मैं किसी को ब्लेम नहीं कर रही हूँ, मैं सिर्फ आपको ये बता रही हूँ कि अपने इकोनॉमिक पैराडाइम्स को पाकिस्तान को अगले साल में देखना है। आपका एक ही सोल्यूशन है, वो है एसएमई, एमएसएमई, माइक्रो स्मॉल मीडियम एंटरप्राइज। आई वर्क इन एग्रीकल्चर। ज़राअत की मैं आपको एक फिगर बता दूं एंड यू रियलाइज कि ये कितना हमारा लॉपसाइडेड सिचुएशन है। ज़राअत में इस वक्त आपकी जीडीपी जो आता है, आपकी जो कमाई आती है पाकिस्तान की, you get 22 trillion from services sector, you get 7 trillion from industry, and nobody talks about agriculture. Agriculture gives you 9 trillion. लेकिन अगर आप सब्सिडी देखें कि हम सब्सिडी किसको देते हैं, हम सब्सिडी सेट को देते हैं। Your state is only producing 7%, 7 trillion to the economy. आपका गरीब farmer is doing 9 trillion to the economy, and look at how much subsidy he has. So I'm going to end here by on a good news, actually, on a happy note, because there's a lot of young people I see here. Venture funding, young ladies and young gentlemen, and everybody else. Venture funding and optimism. ये headline में share करेंगे, इसलिए कैसे अगर आपकी study kindly अपनी website पे लगा लें। पाकिस्तान में fintech, financial technology is on the rise. दुनिया में पहली दफा ऐसा हुआ है, चाहे इस हुकूमतों में क्रेडिट दूं ना दूं, ये एक हकायक है। And I'll read out the names to you. Record level of funding is pouring into Pakistan-based startups. $85 million June 2021 तक आए। अच्छा, कहाँ पे आए हैं? Number 1, Tag Innovation. It is Pakistan's first digital bank. और उनको $5 million मिला है, छोटी अमाउंट से। सदा पे $7.2 million उनको मिला है। Robinhood of Pakistan $4.2 million, 4.5 sorry. ये स्टोरी मैंने नहीं लिखी, ये ग्लोबल जो एंजल इन्वेस्टर्स होते हैं वो ये कहानियां लिखते हैं। यानी कि पाकिस्तान का जो असल सरमाया है हमारी यूथ, उनकी जो सोचे थी बगैर हुकूमत की मदद, मैंने अपनी हुकूमत को क्रेडिट दी थी ना प्रीवियस, पाकिस्तान की यूथ has managed to offset the bias that being a Pakistani carries. You have low ease of doing business, the high cost of doing business, you have difficulty for investors, yet this group of people has managed to push Pakistan on the map. So I will end here, but just to tell you that yes, things are very difficult, but there is always hope and optimism. If you decide, आज आप फैसला करें that we will succeed, we will succeed. And Dr. Saab, आपकी जो women वाली बात है, I agree with you. मैं भी बहुत ख़वातीन थी, no one likes me in my party, and that's okay. This is just on a lighter note. It is very difficult to give respect to women, even though maybe just as hardworking or better than you. But this is a national bias, and we have to overcome it, starting with the people in front of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your concluding remarks. And the one point we do most share is on the focus on MSMEs. And STPI has recently produced a study on strategic directions for Pakistan's agenda for SMEs. I'm sure that our team will be sharing it with you. और इसके साथ हम चलते हैं जरा क्वेश्चन आंसर की तरफ, बट आपको प्लेटों की आवाजें आ रही होंगी, आप प्लेटों के दरमियान और आप हैं हमारे दरमियान. So 5 questions I'll take together, 1 minute only for each questions, और then we will respond. So ज़्यादा दूर ना रखिएगा हमें लंच से, please. Anyone can take questions, please, with the mic. 5 questions maximum.
$25 billion and compared to Vietnam, जो कहीं फिगर आउट ही नहीं होता दुनिया के मैप के ऊपर और जो कि एक लॉन्ग हिस्ट्री है उनकी इन फाइटिंग की, they are exporting more than $350 billion. तो ये बाकी एक it's a matter of shame for us as a nation है. मेरा जो सवाल है सर वो ये है कि government is giving amnesty in real estate और unfortunately पाकिस्तान पे जो वो भी जो majority money है